Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. I think we have some good questions this week, but I can't presently see them, so you just have to trust me. Pretty sure one's about Nvidia. There might also be one about Intel and AMD to give you a bit of a preview, I guess. If you have questions for next week, leave them in the comment section below, or if you're on the Patreon Discord, you can post them in the Ask GN chat. And also, She was supposed to do the out-of-the-box thermal thing. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. So a couple things starting out. First of all, NDXT saw our hashtag plspuck from last week, where we basically jokingly, although some of you didn't seem to clue in on that, jokingly said, tweeted NDXT and asked them for a free puck. Now, I guess it was a half joke because they have given out free pucks in the past, but no one was really expecting like 500 tweets, so they're not going to give away 500. Sorry, guys. If you got one, awesome. But if not, they started a contest from it because they were like, hey, your please puck hashtag has 6 million impressions on Twitter. Which is more than any of your single videos has ever gotten, so we should give some away. So yeah, I don't know the full details. Go to NZXT's Twitter page. All I know is that we will be giving away a small box of GN merch with their prize. So I think the first place person, for whatever the contest guidelines are, will get, I'm pretty sure, a puck. And a Puck Gamers Nexus shirt, which I've worn previously, and also a small box of our merch. So I think that'll probably be like a shirt, a sticker, or something like that. Let us know what your shirt size is if you win. But yeah, so check that out, I guess. Didn't really expect that to happen. Also, very briefly before the first question, our mod mats, we now have a date kind of on the next restock. So the first run sold out completely, ran out of them. We took all the feedback, we mostly being that we need to order more of them. And those should be exiting production sometime. I think we're planning to be able to ship them by end of March to early April. That's the current timeline for it. So that's after shipping, production, all that stuff. We should have more available. If you've been interested in one, store.gamersnexus.net/modmat to backorder one. We'll have probably enough to get everyone who backorders one in the first shipment, unless it goes absolutely crazy. But I think we've ordered enough to prepare for that. So yeah, check that out. Thank you for supporting it. But let's get into the first question. So the first question is from Brammm, who says, with the rumor of new Nvidia GPUs being announced end of March at GTC, what are your expectations for the new GPUs regarding crypto? Do you expect low availability, hiked prices, things like that? First of all, I'm not sure that those rumors are substantiated by anything for GTC. I'm not sure where they originated, but I have no idea if a card is coming out at GTC. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The last few years, it's been more science community driven than it has been gamer driven. I don't know. I'm not expecting a card for gaming at GTC. I'm really not. It could happen, and that'd be great, and we'd all be happy for it. But it's not presently something that I'm expecting, given the state of the current market. Now, as for availability, and I hope I'm wrong on that, but we'll see. There'll be a new card at some point, obviously. I don't think it's going to be that soon. But anyway, availability, typically with the Pascal Nvidia launch, there was a lot of availability at launch. So if they follow that previous trend, and if they're in production now, there should be a lot of cards available. And I guess it'll depend on how good they are at crypto mining, but I don't know. I know what NVIDIA's shipped for volume with Pascal and previous architectures, and it's a freaking lot of cards. So really, unless the demand is that insane, I don't think it'll be impossible to get one like the first day or two or three. They might sell out after that. That's not too atypical these days, but I don't think it's going to be as limited as the cards are today. I certainly don't think that'll be the problem, at least not at initial launch, and I really hope it won't be the problem. As for hiked prices, I'm assuming the question here is basically, if I may rephrase it, is basically, do you think that the current price ladder or hierarchy of GPUs will increase with the next generation? In other words, do I think that a $700 1080 Ti will become a $1,500 1180 Ti, or whatever they call it? There hasn't been a lot of price creep in GPUs over the last few years other than what's going on right now. But as far as MSRP, it hasn't really crept up that much. So if there's an increase, I would hope that it's inside of a range of $100 to $150. And I don't know if Nvidia will do something like they did with the 1080 launch, where they had a higher priced reference card than partner cards, but they really backpedaled on that. So I think that might remain one MSRP for partner and reference cards. As for hiked prices, though, the only thing I really foresee changing the prices in a really solid, like reliable, definitely will change the prices way is the memory prices, less than the crypto miners. I really don't think crypto miners are going to impact the price for MSRP all that much. I think more likely what's going to happen is the $20 to $30 increase for 8 gigabytes of memory will increase MSRP. That's probably what we'll see more than a crypto impact. And there might be a crypto impact. I don't know. It could be that the next generation is completely insane with mining. If it's anything like Volta, it'll be decent, but it's not like it's not gonna flip the industry on its head or anything for mining. So, but yeah, at this point, all I can tell you with any level of confidence is opinions, and my opinions for your questions are, well, this one wasn't a question, but with the rumor of new Nvidia GPUs being announced at end of March at GTC, I don't think there will be a new consumer GPU. I hope I'm wrong. If there's a new GPU announced, I think it's probably going to be data center, enterprise, or science driven. That is not fact. I don't have any tips from anyone. That's my opinion. The next one, expectations for GPUs regarding crypto. We can assume that if the next generation is even remotely close to a mix of Pascal and Volta, we can kind of extrapolate the performance. There's already Volta mining benchmarks. There's Pascal mining benchmarks. I wouldn't expect the next gaming architecture to do better than either of those two. Do you expect low availability? No. And do you expect hiked prices? Yes, insofar as memory cost has gone up, and Nvidia might, or AMD or anyone, might capitalize on the shortage a bit and increase the price a little bit. But I don't expect a 2x cost flagship GPU. And if there is one, I really hope there isn't. If there is one, that'll be big news, and we'll certainly be talking about it. But I really don't expect a 2x cost on that. That's crazy. That's a gigantic jump. And I've seen some reports of that. So that's not what I expect, but we'll see. Next question is Saksham Goyal, who says, should you delid a locked CPU so you can reduce the heat and keep the CPU at maximum turbo clock? Say, for example, delid an i5-8400 and use a better thermal compound and keep the turbo at 4 gigahertz. Locked CPUs for Intel, like the i5-8400, you can look at the turbo tables for them, and basically the lock comes down to, it's not a K-SKU, they don't let you overclock it, pretty much end of story. It does not have to do with thermals. The lock is limiting your multiplier adjustment to the maximum single core turbo of that processor. So what you could do, to answer the question immediately, no, I don't think it's worth delidding an i5-8400 at all, unless you really need it for some reason. And further, if you wanted to push that max turbo clock all the time, buy a motherboard that will allow you to adjust the multiplier, and it won't let you adjust it past the max single core turbo. But you can find one that will let you adjust the multiplier. So let's say the multiplier is something, I don't know off the top of my head what single core is, but let's say it's 44 or 45x. You could apply 44 or 45 in this case to all cores all the time through BIOS with a motherboard that supports it, which is most of them. So that would be the best way to do what you want. You go into BIOS, you set the multiplier to the maximum number that it permits you to do, and assuming you have a reasonable non-Intel stock cooler on there, thermals should really not be a concern. And if they are, then there's a bigger problem with the case or the airflow or the CPU cooler. So that's how you would get, I guess you're saying here, you're going for 4 gigahertz. If that's what that turbo is for the 8400, then you just set it in BIOS to 40 and tell it to apply to all cores, and you've pretty much solved your problem. So yeah, and also if you're curious, you can open up XTU. It's an Intel utility, and they have the turbo tables in there, so you can reference them. I think it's on the right side of the screen, and see what 1 core, 2 core, 3 core, 4 core turbo is, because contrary to popular belief, I certainly don't have it memorized, and it's slightly different for different bins of CPUs. So you can, it's a really good utility. I would recommend it. If you don't have it on your system and you're running an Intel processor, it's cool just to see what information it offers, because it's like, it offers a lot of stuff like hardware info does, less kind of information overall, but it offers the more critical aspects, like are you power throttling, thermal throttling, current limit issues, things like that. It'll tell you in big yellow letters so you can fix it in BIOS. Next one is Motorsport, who says, Steve, why don't you use a smoke machine or incense to show the airflow in cases? Think people would really like to see some claims about how air is moving realized physically. We've done that. So we've done smoke tests in the past. I used smoke pellets for it, and I'm sure we have footage somewhere that's years old of the GoPro shot I did at like 120 FPS at the time. That was fast. But so the problem with smoke testing with cases, it's a really cool concept on the surface, and we did a pretty good job of it. But ultimately, you really only have a couple of frames, even with a reasonably high speed like 240 FPS, because we're not going to go to 1,000 or something. So even at a reasonably high 240 FPS, you still only have a couple of seconds where you can actually see the air channels forming once you start blowing smoke into the system with the method we use. There might be other ways to do it. I used smoke pellets. I'll explain why in a moment. But with that particular method, which I did at the time think was the best option, the smoke would fill the system so fast that you could kind of see a channel forming at the beginning, and then that was it. So you get like 5 to 10 seconds after slowing it down to 30 or 60 FPS, where you can see the channel forming. It's not that exciting. It was a lot of work to set up. It took me like probably 2 hours to set up each time I did it originally. I'm sure I could do it faster now, but it was pretty disappointing for me because I was expecting more. And I think we could do it better today than back then. And I don't know, it might be worth trying again, but smoke testing it's without like a proper chamber to do it. It's really hard to get the effect that everyone wants. And there are also some pretty important side effects of it. So if you use a fog machine, you're now leaving oily residue on all the components. You could electrically short something, and the components, that oil doesn't really ever come off, speaking from experience. Like you can kind of get it off, but it's always going to be there to some extent. And we'd basically need a special smoke testing rig that we're okay with damaging or killing components through electrical shorts, things like that. You could use something that doesn't have water vapor in it, because fog machines do. So you use something that doesn't have water vapor, that'd be a smoke pellet. I guess you could probably find like really anything you could burn and use that. But a smoke pellet's a good option, and it's literally a pellet that you light on fire, and it puts off a huge plume of smoke. That's a good way of doing it without the water vapor problem. You still have smoke going all through the computer. Having done this, it smells like smoke basically forever afterwards. All the components, the case, all of it. Like you can get, I left a case airing out outside for probably a month before the smell was mostly gone. And the components, same thing. So it's like, we could do it, but you have to set up a special secondary bench that you're okay sacrificing. I have ideas to get around it. I don't know if we'll ever do it. But yeah, I've tried it a few different ways, and best case, you get some smoke in there, you get a few frames where you can see the airflow patterns, and that's pretty much it. We've found that through objective testing by populating different fan slots. We've used tape a lot. You may have noticed we tape off a lot of panels and things and do all kinds of extra tests. We've found that that approach to case testing is better to understanding the airflow patterns than smoke. It can be done with objective thermal measurements. We can tape off different corridors of the case and see how it impacts the temperature, and then through just deduction, we can look at that data and say, okay, well, we added a fan to the top, but the CPU temperature went up. Why? How does that make sense? We added a fan, it's intake, it's in front of the CPU. And this is something that you'll see soon has happened. The answer in that specific scenario was found by taping off the top of the case. And the answer was when the case was, when we added a fan, it changed the pressure dynamic of the case such that the CPU cooler, the tower cooler, was no longer pulling air in through the top, even though there's no fans on the top. The pressure would allow the air to just sort of slowly draft in, and adding a fan to the front made it so that the air was actually going out the top instead of in, and more of it was escaping out of the top before it got to the CPU, then got to the CPU. So the point is, we've found generally that that kind of a testing is better to understanding the pressure and airflow situation than smoke. I would love to do more with smoke because it's cool to visualize it, but it's very difficult to get it the way I'm happy with. So yeah, that's pretty much that one. The next one is from Robert Davidson. Robert said, I constantly see people saying that games don't use more than 4 cores on a CPU, but I have a 1950X and noticed that several games use all 32 threads. Do those games benefit from high core count? And if not, will they in the future? Will the 1950X ever be more value in a game at 3.7 gigahertz than 8 threads at 5 gigahertz? We kind of talked about this a little bit in our Threadripper review. I don't think we went into as much depth then as I would now. I understand it more now. So some games, Final Fantasy is a great example. Final Fantasy 15 is one of the few games where when you launch it from memory, at least with a benchmark, it would show every thread more or less semi-populated. And the population of those, the utilization, I should say, of those threads would kind of decrease as you add more threads, but it would scale across all of them, which looks cool from like a utilization standpoint. But in some games we've tested, we found that it's better to have a higher percentage utilization on fewer threads than a lower utilization per thread across a lot of threads. And we've demonstrated this with Ryzen and Threadripper alike. These are good comparisons because they're in the same architecture family, and it's a core count change, there's some cache, some stuff like that, frequency change, but we've demonstrated it there in at least one of our reviews. Can't name it off the top of my head. We've demonstrated it with the Intel family CPUs and the high core count CPUs, so where you see like a 7900X, 7980XE, in a lot of games they'll underperform versus an 8700K. Just like a Threadripper CPU can underperform versus a Ryzen 7 or 5 CPU. It comes down to game programming. Some games will leverage the threads better from memory. Watch Dogs is certainly one of them that we've tested, where we would see better scaling on Threadripper and high core count Ryzen CPUs versus the lower core count Ryzen CPUs, or better scaling on HEDT Intel CPUs versus the standard desktop ones. So there are games that do it, but you also have games like Civilization, for example, where you would assume thread count would matter a lot because Civilization's a really AI CPU intensive game. It spins off threads for AI processing, but it's ultimately in that specific game spinning off one thread for AI processing, and the other threads are much more minor. You'll have maybe a render thread that deals with your draw calls. You might have a, not physics in that game, but you might have some kind of audio thread. And what happens is, because you're doing most of your work on one thread, typically render, maybe AI in this particular instance, that thread just needs to be fast. And it doesn't matter really anything else. So that's an instance where something like 5 gigahertz on fewer threads might be better. But again, Watch Dogs 2 shows the opposite. So it depends on the game. To answer your question more directly, let's see. Will a 1950X ever be more value in a game than 8 threads? The answer is yes, but it depends on the game. And certainly we wouldn't recommend Threadripper for gaming, just like we wouldn't recommend even a 7900X for gaming, which is a cheap HEDT CPU. We'd recommend the $300 parts from AMD or Intel, because those are more suitable for it right now. But you can play games on them, and there are a few games that will leverage those threads, but you've really got to have another use for it. So the answer, though, why do threads scale this way? Look at something like CryEngine. CryEngine has, a while ago, one of the last revisions I paid attention to before they lost their minds at Crytek. CryEngine, at the time when I was looking at it, could do 8 threads. It was the first engine that natively supported spawning of, or saturating 8 threads on a CPU. And so what you could do is, as a developer, you could say, I'm going to push rendering off to this one, physics here, AI here, something else to one of the other threads. And you're ultimately going to be bottlenecked by your most heavily loaded or burdened thread, which is probably render. And if you're falling behind on that one thread, and it's not a really asynchronous pipeline, you're going to fall behind on all of them because you're stuck processing whatever the most there is to do on one thread, which is probably rendering. So we have a really good interview with Sean Tracy from the Star Citizen team, where he talks about thread saturation on CPUs from a high-end game perspective. Go to our channel, go to playlists. I think there's a Star Citizen interviews playlist where I have like 40 of them with them, and search for Sean Tracy, Tracy. It's a great interview, probably one of the best we've ever done with a game developer, and it explains a lot. Next one, Dubs says, you mentioned that certain brands of motherboards will provide higher or lower voltage than what is actually reported by software. Is it really brand X or Y, offsetting voltage, or just the way the components are tested? So some of this can come down to how the motherboard's built, not necessarily by the brand, but specifically what I think I was probably referring to there is some boards, like Gigabyte boards, will be a little bit more generous with their voltage provision than others. We saw this with Kaby Lake when it launched, and we saw this with Coffee Lake when it launched, where auto voltage on either one of those platforms would result in voltage that was way too high. You'd have a 90 degrees Celsius CPU, and you could drop the voltage something like 1.18, 1.2 something, and sustain 60 degrees instead of 90, and it would still be perfectly stable. So that's probably what I was referring to. There are auto voltage tables, there are LLC tables. Those things change between brands, and that is more of a brand thing because it tends to apply on multiple motherboards from that family. Razor says, when will side panel fans make a comeback? In trying a number of cases, I've noticed VRM temperatures are consistently hotter by a small amount of cases, which lack side panel fans. Does Fractal have any designs for making a side panel for the R6? I have no idea about Fractal's plans. Side panel fans making a comeback, stay tuned, subscribe, because we have something coming up soon on that. And I'll leave that there because the rest will be answered in the content. Next question, Keith Berwanger says, if a viewer had an older piece of equipment they'd like to see you compare to a more modern piece, would you consider it as a retrospective piece of content, or do you prefer to work with modern components that have obviously more relevant metrics and to what people search for on YouTube and Google? This is a good question. We do pretty well with retrospectives and with postmortems of things because we did this with a 2600K and the 2500K, the i7-930, a bunch of old CPUs, the Phenom 2s we did last year, and those are ancient, so is the 930. And the content does reasonably. The reason the content does reasonably in those cases is largely because a lot of people still have those, or had those CPUs. Ryzen just launched, Coffee Lake was coming up, everyone wanted to know if they should upgrade or not. So they worked well there. We always will consider looking back at an old piece of hardware. We just looked back at the Raven 02. That's a case. It's not even a CPU, just because it would be kind of fun. So there are times when we'll do it just because it's fun. Most of the time, obviously, hopefully it's relevant to people, like the Sandy Bridge look back, the Phenom look back, because we do need to get traffic to actually make money on it. Otherwise, I'm losing money. So it depends on what the component is. Transparently, if we're going to lose money on looking at it, then it's pretty hard to justify. But sometimes it's worth doing anyway because there could be just some satisfaction in looking at, for example, the Raven 02 and seeing how it does today, just because we really liked that case. So that's an instance where I'd be willing to lose a couple bucks just to see how it does today. But we can't do that all the time. So it does depend on what the component is. But let me know if you have an idea of something you want us to look at, because we would certainly consider it. I think this might be, is this the last one? I think this is the last one. So Cautilus said, apologies if this has been addressed previously, but I was actually wondering if I could ask about the people who aren't on camera right now. I remember names being thrown around like Keegan and Andrew, and I was wondering who exactly are all the behind-the-scenes people at GN. Could you describe their jobs or roles at GN in 1 or 2 sentences for each person? So somewhat chronologically, Keegan has been working with me the longest. He travels to a lot of the trade shows and conventions with me. He does some film and editing work at trade shows primarily, and just did CES with us. He's done Computex with me twice now in Taiwan. So we're pretty used to traveling and working together. His job primarily at those events has been camera and editing work, and lately he's been doing a lot more logistics help for me, management, on the like keeping schedule side of things. Andrew, you mentioned as well. Andrew does all of the day-to-day video editing and rendering, or filming and editing. He does work on 3D models that we use. So if you've seen obviously the intro to this video or any of the other ones, Andrew did that through Blender, and basically does day-to-day video work, and also product design, stuff like that. Patrick assists in, and at this point leads a lot of the case testing. So he's more or less autonomously doing case analysis, and then I help as a test lead, and we look at a case and say, how do we want to test this? And then he takes that test plan and goes and does it, and he writes the review. So we have the website, gamersnexus.net. Patrick's written version of the video that we produce goes up there. He fuels a lot of the build and appearances sections of case reviews. He also programmed our recent console benchmarking tool. And then we have some additional assistance as well outside of day-to-day operation. Ryan helps with some business development stuff, and Eric Hamilton helps with some news writing. And that's most of the current core team for GN. So questions for next week, leave them in the comment section below. Again, the Modmat, we should have them coming in and going out the door immediately, end of March, early April. So get your back order in if you're interested. We've taken feedback. I think we have some improvements in the pipe as well, and future things we're going to be talking about later at a later date. But subscribe for more as always. Patreon.com/GamersNexus helps out directly. We have a separate Patreon Ask GN going up next. And that's all for this one. I'll see you all next time. Is it recording?